Magnus Carlsen is playing some of the best chess of his life, cranking out mini masterpieces virtually every week, and in his latest series, played against the speed demon Daniel Naroditsky, he gave us some real fireworks, the most spectacular of which occurred in the game that I am about to show you. What you're about to see is a perfect example of Magnus Carlsen going beyond the engine as he launches a crazy-looking AlphaZero on steroids style attack with an opening novelty that Stockfish condemns as a total blunder. Yet, it proves to be so difficult for Daniel to deal with that he fails to properly navigate his very narrow path to victory and rapidly crumbles under the relentless pressure of the mighty Magnus. So enough said, let's get right into this chaotic encounter. It's 3-minute blitz. Daniel Naroditsky is playing white, and he opens with e4. Magnus responds c5, the Sicilian defense, and after knight to f3 and knight to c6, known as the Old Sicilian, we have bishop to b5, the Rossolimo attack. An opening where white aims for rapid kingside piece development and castling while preparing to create an early imbalance in the position by capturing the knight on c6, giving up the bishop pair in order to land black with doubled pawns. Magnus responds knight to f6, which is about the fourth most popular move in the position, coming in right behind g6, e6, and d6, but it is the most confrontational of all black's options, attacking white's e-pawn, thereby requiring him to now clarify the position and declare his intentions, whether it be to defend the pawn with d3 or knight to c3, or take the route now chosen by Daniel with the immediate bishop takes c6. Removing the defender of e5 so that he can push his pawn there next, giving a kick to the knight on f6. And this poses an instructive theoretical question: how should black recapture? Generally speaking, you want to capture toward the center, increasing the number of pawns that you can use to exert central control. But here, the move that is by far the most popular is the one now played by Magnus, d takes c6. And I'm going to show you a variation in a few moves to demonstrate why this is the case. Daniel continues e5, and I should probably point out that this is not the most common way for white to proceed. Most top-level players prefer to leave the pawn on e4 and just defend it, usually with the move d3. Because by pushing it to e5, Daniel has removed defense from the d5 square, allowing Magnus to now post up there with knight to d5. So maximum points for aggression, which is important in blitz, but from a theoretical standpoint, this is nothing for white to salivate over. Daniel now castles, at which point we have our shocking opening novelty from Magnus Carlsen. But before we look at that, I want to very briefly show you a line that demonstrates why it was beneficial for black to capture on c6 with his d-pawn instead of his b-pawn. If black were to now play the typical move, g6, preparing the fianchetto, then if white tries to kick his knight off of d5 with the move c4, he can play knight to b4, looking to infiltrate to d3. Now, if black had captured on c6 with his b-pawn and still had his pawn sitting on d7, then d4 would give white an advantage. But here it's not so great due to the activity of black's queen and bishop as a result of the move d takes c6. So after bishop to f5, threatening to come into c2, white can only defend with knight to a3, but now he can't kick the knight out of b4 with the move a3, and black is already practically winning. So good stuff to know when you're facing the Rossolimo attack, but let's get back to the game. In this position, Magnus is about to make one of the worst moves possible. In fact, the only moves that the engine evaluates as being worse are king to d7 and moves that immediately give up a piece like bishop to h3 or knight to c3. So pause the video if you'd like to try to guess the horrendously dubious move that Magnus now plays. It is a sacrifice of a pawn with g5. And this is a perfect example of what happens when humans try to play like AlphaZero. Sometimes you get lucky and play a brilliancy, but here, after Daniel's knight takes g5, white is just winning. Unless, of course, this pawn sacrifice is too brilliant for even Stockfish to grasp. Not impossible, though highly unlikely. Magnus continues rook to g8, taking advantage of the newly opened g-file right away, getting his rook lined up with the white king. And already, after 7 moves, we have a position that is seen in only one in about 370 million online games. So it's basically unheard of. You have a better chance of winning the Powerball than to see this position show up in a random game. And like I said, black is objectively losing. However, white has a very narrow path to victory, and this is what makes Magnus such a genius. He finds these dangerous ideas that are sometimes objectively losing, yet extremely effective at confusing his opponents, thus dramatically increasing their chances of blundering. Daniel's knight is now under attack, and he only has 2 defenses that maintain the win. One is queen to h5, defending while attacking f7, to which black should respond rook to g6, and the other is d3, defending with the dark squared bishop. As white, you really don't want to move your knight right away, since that would open the g8 rook's eyes to your g-pawn. So if you take on h7 for instance, then bishop to h3 is a big problem. You could play knight to e4, planning knight to g3 next to block the file, but this allows black's knight into f4, with queen to d5 coming next to target g2 that way. So d3 is the strongest, just defending the g5 knight, while also keeping black's knight out of f4, but Daniel goes for d4 instead. And you might be thinking, d3, d4, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that after Magnus plays h6, if Daniel were to now play knight to e4, which is still best, and which he did not play, then black can get his pawn back with c takes d4. Since if white were to recapture now with queen takes d4, then he would lose to a very nice tactic. Take a moment and see if you can spot it. Black's winning shot is rook takes g2 check, and if king takes g2, there follows knight to f4 check, winning the white queen. So this is why queen takes d4 is a blunder, which is why the move d4 is a mistake. Did Daniel see this line? It's quite possible, because in the game, after h6 from Magnus, he does not play his best move knight to e4, and instead decides to raise the stakes with knight takes f7, investing a whole piece in what is a rather suspicious looking attack. After king takes f7 and queen to h5 check, if black now had to play king to e6, then white would be winning for reasons that probably don't take much imagination. King to g7 would be even worse, running into a checkmate in 2, starting with bishop takes h6 check. Unfortunately for Daniel, Magnus has the move rook to g6, blocking the check. Play continues f4, looking to attack that pinned rook with f5, which would win a piece. But Daniel's just a day late and a dollar short, because Magnus now has bishop to g4, attacking his queen. Daniel attempts to complicate matters now with e6 check, but after king to g7, black's rook is no longer pinned, the white queen is still attacked. Daniel does now have the move queen to e5 check, but after king to h7, it's becoming painfully clear that something has gone terribly wrong with his attack. He does now get to play his f5 attacking the rook, but after rook to g8, white is just completely busted. And this is a perfect example of how the number of attackers versus the number of defenders will very often determine the success or failure of an attack. Daniel really only has 2 pieces participating in this kingside attack, potentially 3 if he could get his rook involved. His f-pawn has contributed a bit as well, but Magnus has 3 defenders, which could very quickly turn into 4 with the move knight to f6. So the fuzzy math is just not gelling here for Daniel, but it is blitz, so he presses on, capturing the pawn on c5. This does now give him 3 pawns for the sacrificed piece, so that math yields equality, but the geometry of the position is telling a very different story after Magnus's bishop to h3, attacking the g-pawn while pinning it in 2 different ways, to the king as well as to the rook on f1. So Daniel defends with rook to f2, and here's a flash quiz for you. What's black's strongest move? Most crushing is knight to e3, hitting g2 a 3rd time while also threatening queen to d1 check, which would be quite devastating. It would also threaten knight to g4 with the fork of rook and queen. Magnus didn't play this. He went for bishop to g7, which is also very strong and winning. And once again, Daniel chooses aggression over retreat with the move f6, which would allow his queen to get out of danger with check if Magnus were to now play bishop takes f6, but he opts for knight takes f6. Both moves are winning. Daniel continues knight to c3, guarding against queen to d1 check, which brings us to our most inspirational moment of the game, which demonstrates why you should never give up hope, unless of course your position really is hopeless, then you should resign. But in a position like this, which the engine is evaluating as almost 6 pawns in black's favor, Even the world's #1 player will sometimes blunder and throw away his entire winning advantage, as Magnus now does with bishop to h8. It looks pretty reasonable. He's reopening the file for his rook. What could be wrong with that? Take a moment and see if you can spot the one move Daniel now has that can save his game. What Daniel needs to play is queen to e3, threatening both queen takes h6 checkmate and queen takes bishop on h3. Daniel didn't play this move, although he did recognize the vulnerability of the h6 pawn as a result of Magnus's move bishop to h8. He just chose the wrong move to try to exploit it, playing bishop takes h6 instead, apparently hoping for king takes h6, after which he could play queen to e3 check, picking up the h3 bishop. In that case, black would still be winning, but Magnus goes for bishop takes g2, which is also winning after rook takes g2, rook takes g2 check, king takes g2, and king takes h6, bringing us to a position which on paper looks pretty good for white. The black king is totally exposed with 0 pawn cover. It's white's turn to move. He's only 1 pawn down in material, still having his 2 pawns for his sacrificed piece. But again, he just doesn't have the firepower to make any magic happen. Daniel now plays queen to f4 check, and after king to h7, queen to f5 check, and king to g8, we have rook to g1. Okay, looks a little scary getting the rook lined up to the black king, but Magnus just blocks the file with bishop to g7, and after king to h1, he adds defense to his now pinned bishop with his queen. Daniel gets his h-pawn moving now with h4, dreaming of getting it to h6, but this is just way too slow and ineffective. Magnus plays rook to d8. Daniel switches gears now with knight to e2, probably thinking about knight to f4 followed by knight to g6, which could even save his game if black didn't have anything to do in the meantime. But Magnus now goes on the offensive with rook to d5, attacking the queen. It goes to g6, which looks a bit inconvenient for Magnus, as his queen is tied down to defending against checkmate for the moment. But he plays a very nice move now, knight to h5, defended by the rook, adding defense to the bishop, opening his queen's eyes down the f-file, ready to start harassing the white king with queen to f3 check. Daniel tries knight to g3. Why not? There's really nothing else for his knight to do. And here Magnus fails to play his most decisive move, queen to f3 check, which forces mate in another 11 moves. If king to h2, then rook to d2 check will be mate in 8. And if rook to g2, then the cutest way to finish off white would be queen takes g2 check, king takes g2, and knight to f4 check with the fork of king and queen. Magnus, in the game, goes for queen to f6 instead, allowing queen to e8 check, to which he responds king to h7, allowing Daniel to now equalize the piece count for the briefest of moments with knight takes h5, but now comes queen takes h4 check, and after king to g2, Magnus could now force checkmate in 3, beginning with rook to d2 check, but he goes ahead and grabs the knight on h5, now threatening multiple checkmates, the quickest of which would begin with queen to e4 check. Daniel has no good defense, so he decides to part with his queen with queen takes h5 check, seeing that after queen takes h5, he does have rook to h1, forcing Magnus to part with his queen since it is now pinned to his king. However, after queen takes h1 check, Daniel realizes that the resulting endgame will be hopeless and so resigns the game. Seeing that after king takes h1 and bishop takes b2, Magnus remains a bishop to the good with a much healthier pawn structure to boot, not that that even makes a difference. So there it is, Magnus Carlsen's bat crap crazy, impossible to deal with, AlphaZero meets caveman style attack on the castled king that probably left Daniel wondering just where he went wrong and how he could let Magnus get away with such brash and irresponsible behavior. So feel free to try this at home, push those G and H pawns early and often, regardless of whether you've castled. That's the AlphaZero way. Have some fun, confuse your opponents, leave them feeling angry, disgusted, or inspired to learn from their mistakes. But before you do that, if you enjoyed this content, do consider subscribing to the channel, hitting the like button, leaving a comment. All those things help the channel grow, and I will see you next time.